Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got another kit to put together. It's another WPL model with the same axles and gearbox as the B1 that we've been modifying. This one though, rather than coming with that dire toy grade radio, they leave it up to the builder to provide all the electronics. First we'll have a look through the box as is traditional. On the top we've got the instructions. Two sheets in fairly good English with enough detail in the diagrams to see how it all goes together. Interestingly, while the English instructions were loose in the box, the Chinese ones are sealed in a plastic packet. I do wonder if the English ones were added as an afterthought after the kits were boxed up. In the first packet we've got the interior parts and the detail bits for the outside of the body, the windscreen wipers, door handles and all that kind of thing. The plastic's got a little bit of flex to it, which is good. It really doesn't feel brittle at all. Second packet, and we've got the cab. Nicely detailed, but it's a bit odd. It's partially assembled with the second set of interior bits already fitted. Considering how cheap the kit is, it's surprising they're not a bit more careful with what ends up in the box. In this bag we've got the wheels, tyres and most of the other big bits of plastic for the chassis. Here we've got a packet of grease, and one of the things that separates the kit from the ready to run, it actually comes with a proper little servo. It remains to be seen how good it is though. Also in the packet is the gearbox and a couple of LEDs. Next packet, it's the axles. They do look pretty simple, but they do have some nice little nylon bushes, so they might last a little while before they actually wear out. The last big packet has the tray that goes behind the cab and a few other little bits to complete the body. That just leaves the chassis rails. They're stamped out from what feels like steel rather than aluminium. And here's the last bag, which has a large amount of small self-tappers. There appears to be 3 or 4 different types. That all looks like a nice collection of bits to put together. One thing to watch out for though is almost all the packets were already ripped open. In the bottom of the box there was a couple of escapees. Reading the comments on the forums, it seems to be not that uncommon to have bits missing, which isn't so good. Now, since this isn't a big kit, we can spread all the parts out so they're easy to identify during the build. It's something I wish I had the space to do with the big kits too. It makes it so much easier to put the kit together. Right then, time to put it together. Now, since I reckon there's going to be a degree of tweaking to do, we're going to make a rolling chassis as WPL intended in this video, adding the servo, ESC and radio later. I think just like with the B1, making the steering work nicely is going to involve some cutting, and it's going to be a lot easier to size things up with the truck complete. The instructions are split up into pages with a number in the bottom right corner. Each page completes a section of the build and is split into subsections. Quite a nice layout really. The first step of the instructions is to fit the shocks to the chassis rails. Well, actually the first step of the instructions is to build the shocks, but since they're already complete we can move straight on to fitting them. It doesn't say which screws to use for them. I'm going to guess it's the number 1s, since some of the other diagrams call other numbered screws, but never number 1. So I reckon unless otherwise specified, we'll try the number 1s and see how they fit. To fit the shocks, all we do is line up the hole in the body with the hole in the chassis and fit a screw. This isn't a hobby grade RC, so rather than having a nice ball end, the shocks get their motion from being able to float around in the hole. If you fully seat the screw, the shocks won't be able to move enough and the suspension's going to bind up. When all 4 are fitted, we can sit back and admire the rails. If you look carefully, you might notice I've built 2 of the same side. It's an easy fix though. If we swap the shocks on one of the rails to the other side, we're good to move on. This time we've got the centre skid / gearbox mount. Other than making sure you get it the right way round, there's not much to fitting it. The holes line up well enough. It's no Tamiya, but it's better than some of the other hobby grade kits I've come across. Again, the diagrams don't say which screws to use, so I'm just going to use more of the number 1s. They seem to be a good fit with the right sort of length, so I think they're going to do. When we're installing all these screws, we want them to be just slightly loose until we've got all the bits that connect the chassis rails together. Before the gearbox goes in, we need to fit the motor. It's just a press fit, but it does need quite a bit of force to get it all the way in. The gearbox feels like it's already got some grease in, so I'm going to leave it be. Having said that, it might be a good idea to open it up to make sure the motor pinion meshes correctly with the second gear. Just be careful with it, it's not the strongest assembly. To fit the gearbox, we're just going to use another couple of number 1 screws. Next we've got the servo tray. It's designed for the abomination that is the steering motor that comes with the RTR. We're going to need to modify it to fit the servo and the other bits, but for now we'll just fit it stock so we can get a better idea how to tackle the mods later. It fits between the chassis rails quite nicely, and it gets fitted with yet more number 1s. The rear of the chassis gets a small cross member now, which is fitted with 4 more number 1s. Seems a little overkill, 2 would probably do the job. Now we've got those bits in, we can go around and nip up all the screws so you've got a nice solid, relatively straight frame to build the rest on. Next up, we've got the plate that sits over the servo tray. Its main purpose seems to be to mount the cab to the chassis. I wonder if we could open up a hole in the centre for some extra clearance over the electronics. And not too surprisingly, it gets fitted with another couple of number 1s. Bumper next. It fits to the servo tray and includes the grille and the headlights. Quite neat, as that means when we wire up the lights we can take the cab off without disturbing the wiring. It should make for a really neat install with no connectors. Surprise surprise, it gets fitted with yet another pair of number 1s. And that's page 1 finished. Next up we've got the axles. Okay, for the axles it will really pay off getting the 2 halves to fit nicely together. Right now they're pressed together and there's a little bit of a gap. It looks like there's still some traces of where they were cut from the parts tree. It's easy to fix though, we just need to very carefully trim anything that shouldn't be there and give it a test fit. When the 2 halves fit nicely together, we can move on. The internals of the axles are pre-built, so other than a quick test fit to make sure it's correctly positioned, all we need to do is add a small amount of grease to keep the bushes happy. All we do is slide the bushes away from the final position, add a smear of grease to the shaft and slide the bushing back. Pop the shaft in the axle housing and install the other half. For the front axle we should also install the hubs, but I found trying to keep them in while completing the next step was an exercise in frustration, so we're going to fit them later. On one side of the axles we need to fit the diff cover. For now we just press fit it into position. It's got 4 posts that are a very tight fit in the axle. On the other side we have the drive shaft. On the other side we have the drive shaft. It has a correct way round to get the gears to mesh. Before we fit it though, we need a blob of grease inside to keep everything nicely lubricated. To hold it together we use the long screws that were with the axle bits in their bag. They go through the holes in the diff cover and thread into the other side. Do the screws up a little bit at a time, doing them corner to corner to try and get them all to come together nice and straight. Hubs next, and all we need to do is add a little smear of grease to the stubs and pop them into the hubs. The axle housings are flexible enough we can very carefully open them up and slot the hubs into place. But be careful not to open them up any more than needed to get them in. We don't want to push our luck. And that's it for the front axle. The rear is exactly the same, other than the steering bits of course, so rather than repeat all that we'll just cut to it being complete. Next we've got the brackets for the top suspension links. The instructions have them fitted with some of the self-tapping screws. The problem is most of them don't fit the holes, and they're way too short to actually hold the axle housing halves together. So rather than mess about, I think it's easier just to use some M2 screws and nuts. These ones are M2 by 20s, so they're going to need to get cut down. But they go all the way through the bracket and the axle, and with a nut on the bottom they're going to really clamp the axle together nicely. After a quick trim with the Dremel, they do look rather tidy. Technically I suppose that's going to be the first mod. Nice! There's one more thing to do with the front axle before we move on. We need to install the drag link. It fits to the underside of the arms on the hubs and uses a couple of number 1 screws to hold it in position. This will be modified when we fit the steering servo, but for now it's going to help stop things flapping around so much while building. Okay, on to page 3, and we're mounting the axles to the chassis. This truck has proper, if a bit basic, 4-link suspension. There's 2 types of links, the bottom ones which have a large ring at one end, and the top ones which don't. Top link first, the end with almost a bull cup fits over the mounts on the bracket we fitted to the axles. Just like with the shocks, the design relies on being able to freely move around, so you need to leave a small gap between the screw head and the link. It should be able to move around quite a bit without binding. Same with the other top link. It's going to make for a slightly wobbly setup compared to proper ball ends, but I'm sure it's going to do the job. The axle can get offered up to the chassis now, and the top links can be attached to the frame. Not too surprisingly, they use yet more number 1 screws, and again they don't want to be tight, the links should be able to move around very freely. Next we can couple up the drive shaft and start installing the bottom links. This time the end with the large ring fits to the axle, but without a screw yet. The other end fits to the frame with a number 1 screw, and when both the bottom links are on, the bottom of the shocks fit over the same mounting on the axles as the links, followed by a number 1 screw. And just like the rest of the screws, we need to make sure everything can freely move around. It would be very easy to completely lock up the suspension if all the screws were just a little bit too tight. The final setup does seem to work rather well. There's no damping of course, so it's going to be a bit bouncy. But everything moves as it should, so I think it's going to work quite nicely when we get it all running. The rear axle is exactly the same, except after I got the links on I found the drive shaft was holding the axle up. It's just a little bit too long to allow the axle to freely move up and down. You can see on the front axle there's a gap between the inner and outer parts, allowing the shaft to shorten as the axle moves. But it's an easy fix. All we do is trim a few millimeters from the drive shaft's inner and outer to make it a bit shorter. Once done and refitted, the axle moves up and down nice and smoothly with no binding. Perfect. So that's the chassis complete. We can move on to page 4 and a rear tray. In addition, we'll also need a wheel, tyre and mount and the metal plate. First we can stretch a tyre over the wheel. Now, compared to the RTR B1, these tyres are extremely soft. They're going to need gluing before we actually run the truck, or they're just going to fall straight off the rims. For now though, we're going to leave them unglued so we can pull them off again to paint the wheels. The metal plate sits in a recess in the tray. The only thing to watch out for is to make sure all the holes line up. The holes at the front get a number 1 each, leaving them loose until the other 2 go in too. The spare tyre mount sits over the other 2 holes, making sure it's leaning towards the back, and fit 2 more number 1 screws. They do seem a bit short, but there aren't any longer ones in the kit. Pop the wheel over the post, and this time we get to use a number 2 screw. It's the same as a number 1, except it doesn't have a washer built in under the head. Very nice. Okay, page 5 and the cab. Now, since our cab already has the interior and windows fitted, we can go straight on to adding the accessories. Except most of them are going to need a spot of glue to keep them in position, and at some point we will be painting the cab, so for now we're going to skip most of the parts. We can fit the steps though. They need clipping from the tree, and they'll need some number 1 screws. They're made from a nice flexible plastic, so they're going to add a degree of protection. To fit, they just offer up inside the body and get a pair of screws each. Because the plastic's very soft, it would be easy to strip the holes, so be very careful not to over tighten them. The roll bar that sits behind the cab has a light bar to fit. There's no screws here, it just presses into place. With any luck, it's going to stay there when the truck rolls over. To fit the body to the chassis, we start with the tray. It's got 2 large lugs that fit over the chassis rails. Then, to keep it in place, we use a number 1 screw on each side, but leaving them loose for now. At the back, it goes in through the rear cross member and into a post under the tray. With that snug, we can go and nip up the other 2 screws. Next is the cab. It's got a couple of lugs at the back that need to go under the tray before you can sit the front down on the mounting plate. There's a bit of a knack to it, but once it's in place, everything fits rather nicely. For the screws, we're using the ones that are ever so slightly bigger in diameter than all the rest. The first 2 go in under the bonnet. They're hard to see in the video, but there's a hole on each side. Next, the roll bar goes on behind the cab using 2 more of the slightly larger screws. The bar is made of that slightly softer plastic, so we need to watch out for stripping the threads. The area under the roll bar is for the battery, and rather than the opening bonnet that the B1 has, this truck has a toolbox. It's got 2 clips that are just a press fit to make the hinges. Not quite as neat, but it's going to work well enough. Okay, well, we're nearly done now. We've got the last 4 wheels and tyres to mount up. Again, they're going to need gluing before we actually run the truck, but we'll do that later so we can paint the wheels. They simply offer up over the hexes, and a number 2 screw goes in to stop them falling off. Simple, but it should work well enough. That would be the rolling chassis done, but I did miss a couple of screws. Right at the front there's two more that go in to clamp the front of the cab to the grille, making the whole structure absolutely solid, and this is where a magnetic screwdriver really helps. Right, so with those last two in, we do have a rolling chassis, plus body, and I must say I do rather like it. It's not as nice as some of the mini hobby grade RC, not by a long way, but this cost me 30 quid, so that makes up for a lot of the rather basic construction. Next time we're going to have a look at fitting the servo and getting the steering working, and hopefully fit the radio and ESC too, perhaps even going as far as painting it if there's time. But for this week that's about it, so I hope you liked it. If you did, do please hit the like button, it's always greatly appreciated, and while you're in the area you might as well click the subscribe button if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, bye guys!